April 10th, 1241. Dawn crept slowly over the plains of the Kingdom of Hungary, a pale grey light spreading across the damp grasslands near the Sazho River. The night's cold still clung to the earth. Thin mist rose from the water like breath from a wounded giant, drifting silently between the tents of the Hungarian army. Horses stamped the frozen ground. Armour creaked softly as soldiers stirred from restless sleep. To the west lay the Hungarian camp, a forest of banners and shields glimmering faintly in the morning haze. Thousands of warriors gathered there, knights in chainmail, infantry with spears and crossbows, nobles wrapped in fur cloaks beside campfires that were now dying to embers. They had marched here to defend their kingdom, their faith, and their homes. Beyond the river, the horizon moved. At first it looked like shadow, a shifting line across the distant hills. But as the sun rose higher, the shapes multiplied. Riders, thousands of them, dark figures spreading across the plain like a tide rolling toward the shore. The Mongols had arrived. Their army stretched across the steppe like a living serpent of steel and leather, horsemen arranged in disciplined formations that seemed to flow and coil with unnatural precision. Banners snapped in the cold wind. Horses snorted clouds of steam into the pale morning air. They had come from the far edge of the world. In the years before this morning, these warriors had conquered lands that once seemed untouchable. Cities burned behind them. Armies vanished before them. Kingdoms collapsed like houses of straw before a storm. They had crushed the princes of the eastern forests. They had broken the knights of Poland. They had erased entire cities from the map. Now they stood at the gates of Central Europe. The Hungarian host was large, perhaps 60,000 men gathered beneath the banner of their king. It was one of the greatest armies the kingdom had ever fielded. Knights armoured in iron sat atop massive war horses, confident that their charge could break any enemy on earth. Across the river waited fewer Mongols, perhaps 30,000. But numbers had never saved anyone from them, because these riders did not fight like the armies of Europe. They moved faster, they struck harder, and they did not fear death. Some whispered that they were not men at all, but demons sent by God to punish the world. If Hungary fell today, the road to Western Europe would lie open. Germany, Italy, France. Nothing would stand between the Mongol storm and the heart of Christendom. But on this cold morning beside the Sazho River, one kingdom would make its stand, and what happened here would change the fate of Europe forever. The battle had not begun, but history had already turned. The riders who waited beyond the Sazho River did not appear suddenly. They had been moving west for years, crossing continents the way storms cross oceans. Slow at first, distant thunder on the horizon, and then suddenly, everywhere at once. Their empire had begun far away on the wind-swept grasslands of Central Asia, where tribes had once fought endless wars for pasture and survival. Out of those tribes rose a single leader, a man whose armies would transform warfare forever: Genghis Khan. Under his command, scattered clans became a disciplined war machine, unlike anything the medieval world had seen. They did not build walls. They did not settle cities. They rode. Across deserts, across mountains, across endless steppe. But the empire that now threatened Europe no longer belonged to Genghis Khan himself. It had passed to his descendants, men raised in the same brutal traditions of conquest. Among them was Batu Khan, who now led the Mongol armies driving relentlessly toward the heart of Europe. At his side rode the true architect of the campaign, Subutai. Subutai did not fight battles, he designed them. Where other generals saw armies, he saw patterns. Where others saw geography, he saw weapons. Rivers became traps. Mountains became shields. Entire campaigns unfolded in his mind, like chess games played across continents. And by the year 1241, his plans had already shattered half of Eastern Europe. Cities of the Rus burned behind the Mongol advance. Princes who had ruled for generations died in fields littered with broken banners. Refugees fled westward in endless columns, carrying stories that seemed too terrible to believe. They spoke of armies that moved faster than rumor, of riders who could fire arrows at full gallop with deadly accuracy, of enemies who pretended to retreat, only to turn suddenly and destroy the pursuers. Entire armies had vanished, chasing those false retreats. In Poland, European knights had gathered to resist the Mongols. They believed their armor and courage would stop the invasion. They charged into battle with banners flying and lances lowered. But courage alone was not enough. The Mongols destroyed them. Word of that disaster spread across Europe like wildfire, and every messenger carried the same message. The storm was moving west. Hungary stood directly in its path. The kingdom itself was strong by European standards, ruled by a determined monarch, Bela IV of Hungary. Bela understood the danger long before many of his nobles did. Reports from the east were too consistent to ignore. Villages burned, armies annihilated, nations collapsing almost overnight. He began preparing his kingdom. But Hungary was not united. Years before the Mongols arrived, another people had fled westward across the steppe. The Cumans, nomadic warriors who themselves had been defeated by the Mongol advance. Desperate for protection, they sought refuge within Hungary's borders. Bela allowed them to settle. It was a practical decision. The Cumans were skilled horsemen, valuable allies against the coming threat. Their warriors could strengthen Hungary's army. But many Hungarian nobles despised them. They saw the Cumans as outsiders, pagans who spoke strange languages, lived by different laws, and brought the Mongols closer to Hungary's doorstep. Tensions grew quickly. Accusations spread through the court. Violence simmered in the countryside. Hungary was preparing for invasion. But internally, it was already fracturing. Meanwhile, the Mongols were moving with terrifying precision. Subutai did not launch a single army into Europe. He launched several, spreading them across hundreds of miles so they could converge on their targets from different directions. One Mongol force struck Poland. Another swept through the Carpathian passes. A third rode directly toward the Hungarian heartland. But to the Hungarians watching from their castles and villages, the enemy seemed endless. They appeared suddenly on distant hills. They vanished into forests. Then they returned in greater numbers. Rumors grew darker with every passing week. Some claimed the Mongols never slept. Others swore their horses could ride for days without stopping. Priests whispered that perhaps God himself had sent them as punishment. Fear spread faster than the Mongol horses. Villages emptied. Refugees crowded the roads. Bells rang in churches across the kingdom as people prayed for protection. But the Mongol army kept coming. And when their scouts finally reached the plains near the Sayo River in the spring of 1241, Subutai already knew exactly where the decisive battle would take place, because he had chosen the battlefield months earlier. And by the time the Hungarian army arrived, The trap had already begun to close. The ground near the Sayo River did not look like a place where empires would be tested. It was not a famous mountain pass, nor a holy city, nor some towering fortress on a cliff. It was a river plain in spring, flat in places, treacherous in others, cut by water, marsh, and narrow crossing points that could turn movement into confusion within minutes. That was precisely why it mattered. The Sayo flowed cold and dark through the Hungarian countryside, its banks softened by thaw and rain. The fields around it could support a large army for a short time, but not an orderly one. Wagons bogged down, horses slipped in wet ground, marshy patches hid beneath grass that looked harmless in the dim light. A commander who understood the terrain could use it like a blade. A commander who misread it might trap his own army without realizing it. The Hungarian host arrived with confidence. It was one of the largest forces assembled in the kingdom for generations, a great gathering of nobles, retainers, churchmen, heavy cavalry, infantry levies, and allied riders, all drawn together by the fear that had been rolling west from the steppe. Their king, Bela IV, did not ride among dreamers. He rode among men who knew what had happened to those who underestimated the Mongols. But knowledge and readiness are not the same thing. Hungary had numbers, courage, and rank. The Mongols had experience, unity, and design. The Hungarian army was built in the European fashion, and its strength rested in shock. Armoured knights formed its hard core, men in chainmail and iron caps mounted on powerful horses, carrying lances made to break a line in one terrible rush. Around them stood infantry with spears, axes, and shields, along with crossbowmen whose bolts could punch through armour at close range. There were also lighter cavalry and allied nomadic riders, including Cumans, whose presence still stirred distrust inside the kingdom. In theory, this army could hold ground, crush an exposed enemy, and defend the king. But only if it fought as one. That was the weakness. Hungary had assembled an army. The Mongols were bringing a system. Across the river, Batu Khan's army looked different in every possible way. The Mongol warrior carried less armour, but more speed. He rode small, durable horses that could cross distances European war horses could scarcely endure. His greatest weapon was not his sabre or lance, but the composite bow, a recurved weapon of horn, wood, and sinew that could cast arrows with terrifying force from horseback. These riders did not need to stop to shoot. They did not need to form a grand line to kill. They moved, scattered, regrouped, and fired while turning, retreating, circling, and striking again. They could make distance vanish. And they were never alone. The Mongol army also carried engineers, men who built bridges, prepared siege devices, and improvised solutions in the field with chilling speed. They used signals, flags, drums, horns, and disciplined relay command. Orders did not crawl through confusion. They flew. A European noble might shout to men who knew his face. A Mongol commander could redirect thousands through a few gestures and sound calls that had been drilled into them across years of campaigning. But the most dangerous thing in the Mongol camp was not visible in the weapons. It was memory. These men had fought through China, Persia, the Ruslands, and Eastern Europe. They had crossed rivers under fire before. They had baited heavier armies before. They had watched proud enemies charge in triumph before. And they had destroyed them before. Subutai studied the ground as though it were already speaking to him. The main bridge over the Saho would matter, because the Hungarians believed it mattered most. It was the obvious crossing, the visible crossing, the crossing that demanded attention. That alone made it useful. But obvious points are often decoys in the hands of a great commander. Subutai understood that if the Hungarians fixed their gaze on one place, they could be struck from another. So the Mongol plan was simple enough to explain and difficult enough to survive. Pin the enemy at the bridge. Distract him with pressure where he expects danger. Then cross elsewhere, in darkness or concealment, and fall upon him from more than one direction before he can reorganize. Once the Hungarian army is compressed, confused, and boxed into its own camp, do not merely attack it, suffocate it. The Hungarian plan was less elegant and more familiar. Hold position, guard the crossing, use the camp as protection. Meet any direct assault with force, and if the enemy presses too hard, counterattack with heavy cavalry. This was not foolish in the abstract. A fortified camp could protect a large medieval army from sudden collapse. A defended crossing could bleed an attacker. The problem was not that the idea lacked logic. The problem was that it assumed a single front and a single rhythm of battle. The Mongols rarely granted either. Inside the Hungarian camp, the army settled uneasily into its waiting. Wagons were arranged into defensive lines. Tents spread across the ground in imperfect order. Horses were watered. Armor was checked again and again by hands that wanted something to do. The air smelled of smoke, leather, wet earth, and animal breath. Men spoke in low voices, and every conversation seemed to circle the same question without naming it directly. Were the stories true? Some said no army could withstand a nightly charge, but others had heard that in Poland men had said the same thing. Some insisted the Mongols were only raiders, steppe riders who would scatter if struck hard. But those who had seen refugees arriving from the east knew that raiders did not erase cities. Toward evening, the camp changed mood. Daylight gives armies the illusion of control. Night takes it away. Priests moved among the soldiers with crosses, relics, and murmured blessings. Confessions were heard beside wagons. Men who had killed before asked forgiveness for what they might do at dawn. Others, younger and quieter, asked forgiveness because they feared they would not do enough. Candle flames flickered inside makeshift chapels of canvas and wood. Somewhere a hymn began, thin at first, then stronger as more voices joined, carried over the damp ground in wavering lines. In another part of the camp, blacksmiths and armourers worked by firelight. Sparks leapt upward each time metal was struck. Sword edges were tested with thumbs. Lance shafts were inspected for cracks. Crossbow strings were tightened and waxed. Helmets were placed on knees while men ran cloth across the inside rim, as if simple order could protect the mind from what was coming. Horses were brushed, fed, and touched on the neck by men who might trust an animal more than a commander. Bela IV moved through this world not as a symbol on a throne, but as a king among men about to be tested. He had no luxury of ignorance. He had seen his nobles argue, seen his kingdom divided by suspicion, seen warnings dismissed until the danger stood at the river itself. But now there was no court politics, only the army and the enemy. A king can command loyalty in a hall with banners overhead. On the eve of battle, he must command something more fragile: belief. He inspected positions, spoke with commanders, and listened. That mattered. A ruler who only speaks hears too late. Yet even now, beneath the structure of command, Hungary remained uneasy. Some distrusted the Cumans. Some blamed them for bringing the invasion upon the kingdom. Some nobles resented the king's reforms from earlier years and obeyed him with clenched pride rather than full conviction. An army can march with hidden fractures. Under pressure, those fractures widen. Across the river, the Mongol camp was quieter. There were preparations there too, but they lacked the emotional theatre of the Christian host. Saddles were checked, bowstrings guarded from damp, arrow bundles counted and redistributed. Horses rested in shifts. Men ate, repaired tack, and slept when ordered. Ritual existed, but not as display. The Mongols carried their world with them. Their discipline was prayer in another language. Subutai did not need speeches. He needed timing. Somewhere in the dark, away from the obvious crossing, preparations began for the move that would decide the battle. Men gathered tools. Timber was measured. Scouts rode out and returned. The river was studied in silence. This was not improvisation. It was execution. The night deepened. Fires in the Hungarian camp burned lower, some bright, some reduced to red wounds in the dark. Armour hung from wagon sides. Men lay awake pretending to sleep. Others slept deeply from exhaustion, which is sometimes mistaken for peace. The cold pressed harder after midnight. Mist pooled near the riverbanks. A horse cried out once, sharply, then fell quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded, faint enough to be mistaken for memory. No one in the Hungarian camp could see the entire shape of what approached them. That was another Mongol advantage. The enemy did not simply attack your body. He occupied your imagination first. He filled the darkness with possibilities. He made every sound a warning, every pause a threat, every report incomplete. Before dawn, some soldiers rose and made the sign of the cross with hands that trembled despite themselves. Some kissed small relics or tokens from home. Some stared into darkness and thought of wives, fathers, sons, and unfinished seasons in fields they might never see again. There is always a moment before great violence when armies are still made of individual men. Breath, memory, fear, hope. After that moment, they become movement and noise and death. At the Sayo River, that moment was ending. The bridge stood waiting in the gloom. The river moved beneath it, black and indifferent. Hungarian commanders believed the first crisis would come there. They were right. They were not right about where it would end. At first, there was only mist, pale and drifting above the water, like breath rising from a wounded earth. The Hungarian camp stirred behind its wagon lines, armour clinking softly as men climbed to their feet. Horses stamped and snorted. Leather straps creaked as saddles were tightened.
Then came the sound. Distant hooves. Not thunder. Not yet. Just a rhythm, steady and deliberate, echoing faintly across the damp plains beyond the river. Scouts rode in quickly, mud splashed across their cloaks, shouting warnings that travelled through the camp like sparks through dry straw. Mongol riders were approaching the bridge. Men grabbed shields, helmets were lowered, crossbows were lifted to wagon rails. The Hungarian army rushed toward the river crossing, confident that the first clash of the day would come there. And for a moment, it did. Phase 1. The bridge.
The first Mongol riders appeared through the fog in loose formations, their horses moving with eerie calm. They did not charge wildly, they advanced in measured waves, bows already raised. Arrows flashed through the morning air. The Hungarian defenders answered with crossbows and javelins from behind the wagon barricades near the bridge. Bolts cracked through leather armor, horses screamed and collapsed into the mud, but the Mongols did not press hard. They rode forward, fired, and then withdrew again, drifting back into the fog beyond the river like shadows retreating before light. The Hungarian commanders watched with satisfaction. The enemy was probing the bridge, exactly as expected. But the bridge was only the stage. The real battle was already moving elsewhere. Phase 2. The hidden crossing. Hours passed. The sun climbed slowly through the grey sky, turning the mist above the valley into pale ribbons drifting across the fields. The Hungarian army remained fixed near the crossing, confident that they controlled the gateway across the river. But upstream, hidden behind low ground and drifting fog, another force was moving. Under Subutai's command, Mongol engineers and cavalry had spent the night constructing a secret crossing. Timber beams and makeshift pontoons had been assembled silently in darkness. Horses were guided through shallow points of the river while men stabilized the passage. One unit crossed, then another. Thousands of riders began moving south, unseen behind the hills. They were already behind the Hungarian army, but the Hungarians did not know. By late morning, the Mongols intensified their attack at the bridge. Arrows rained against Hungarian shields. Riders surged forward, then wheeled away again with impossible speed. Dust and mist blended into a grey chaos along the riverbank. The Hungarian defenders pushed them back. Victory seemed possible. But then horns sounded behind them. At first the sound was faint, a distant echo from across the valley. Then it grew louder. Hungarian soldiers turned. Across the fields to the south, a new line of riders appeared on the horizon. Mongols, thousands of them. The hidden crossing had worked. Subutai's army had slipped behind the Hungarian camp and was now advancing from the rear. For a moment, the entire battlefield froze. Then the arrows began. They fell in dark waves across the Hungarian positions, striking men, horses, wagons, banners. Riders swept around the edges of the camp, firing constantly while circling just beyond the reach of infantry. The Hungarian army was no longer defending a bridge, it was trapped. Phase 4. Chaos. By noon, the battle had turned into something far worse than defeat. It had become confusion. Hungarian knights mounted quickly and attempted to organize a charge against the Mongols attacking from behind. Heavy cavalry surged forward across the fields, lances lowered, armor glinting beneath the cold sunlight. For a brief moment, it worked. The knights smashed into a cluster of Mongol riders and scattered them. Horses collided, sabers flashed. Dust exploded beneath hooves. But the Mongols did not hold their ground. They scattered. They always scattered. They pulled away from the charge, retreating just far enough to keep distance while continuing to fire arrows backward from the saddle. The Hungarian knights pursued them across open ground. And that was the mistake. Because the Mongols were not retreating. They were drawing the knights away from the infantry. Arrows fell relentlessly on the isolated cavalry. Horses staggered beneath wounds. Riders toppled into the grass. The knights attempted to regroup, but every attempt to reform their line triggered another wave of Mongol arrows. Behind them, the Hungarian infantry struggled to defend the wagon camp. But the Mongols were attacking from every direction now. Arrows, smoke, dust, shouting. The air smelled of sweat, mud, blood, and the bitter smoke of burning wood as fires began spreading through abandoned wagons. But the Hungarian army did not collapse immediately. They fought. Infantry formed shield walls. Crossbowmen fired from between wagon gaps. Knights rallied again and again, launching desperate charges against the swirling Mongol formations. But each success dissolved moments later. Every time the Hungarians advanced, the Mongols vanished. Every time they paused, arrows fell again. The battlefield became a storm, and the Hungarians were standing in the open. By mid-afternoon, the Hungarian army was breaking apart. Units could no longer see their commanders through the dust and smoke. Orders vanished in the roar of battle. Men fought beside strangers who spoke different dialects, following instincts instead of commands. The Mongols tightened the circle. They rode around the edges of the camp, sealing every escape route except one narrow opening to the west. It looked like an accident, a gap left in the chaos, but it was deliberate. Subutai had created a funnel. Desperate soldiers began rushing toward that opening, hoping to escape the slaughter. Infantry abandoned wagons. Knights tried to break through with scattered charges. And the moment they did, the Mongols surged forward. Arrows fell into the fleeing columns. Cavalry crashed into disorganized clusters of soldiers. What had been an army became a stampede of men fighting simply to survive. Some ran for the river. Others tried to push through the narrow exit in the Mongol lines. Few succeeded. Thousands died in the fields around the camp, cut down while fleeing or crushed beneath horses in the chaos of retreat. When the fighting finally faded, the battlefield beside the Sayo River fell into an eerie silence. Moments before, the valley had roared with the chaos of men and horses, arrows and screams, armor clashing and wagons burning. Now only scattered sounds remained. The groan of wounded men, the distant cry of horses wandering riderless across the fields, the crackling of fire consuming abandoned camp wagons. The Hungarian army had ceased to exist. Thousands lay where they had fallen, their shields half buried in mud, their banners trampled beneath hooves. The once proud formations of knights and infantry had dissolved into scattered bodies across the valley. Armour glimmered faintly through drifting smoke. Broken lances lay in tangled piles. Helmets rolled in the grass like discarded bowls. No one knew the exact number of the dead. Chroniclers who later walked the battlefield tried to count the losses, but the scale of the disaster made certainty impossible. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers had entered the valley. Only fragments of that army survived the day. Many had died fighting. Many more had died running. King Bela IV of Hungary had escaped only by the narrowest margin. When the camp collapsed, loyal knights carved a desperate path through the chaos and forced the king toward the western roads. Mud clung to their armour. Arrows struck their shields as they rode. Several of the king's companions fell behind, cut down while covering his escape. But Bela survived. He had to, because his kingdom no longer existed in any meaningful sense. After the battle, the Mongol army did not stop to celebrate victory. That was not their way. Victory was not a moment for them. It was a process. The destruction of Hungary had only begun. The Mongol riders spread across the countryside like fire through dry grass. Villages that had stood for generations disappeared in hours. Wooden houses burned quickly, their roofs collapsing into glowing piles while smoke rolled across the open plains. Livestock scattered, crops were trampled beneath thousands of hooves. Anyone who resisted died. Anyone who ran was hunted. Entire communities vanished. Refugees fled toward castles and fortified towns, believing stone walls might save them where open fields had not. But many of Hungary's defences had been neglected or poorly maintained. Some castles held, many did not. Across the kingdom, the same scene repeated itself again and again. Riders appearing on the horizon, smoke rising behind them, bells ringing desperately in village churches as people ran toward whatever shelter they could find. The winter that followed was worse. By the time the Mongol army finished its campaign across Hungary, vast portions of the countryside were empty. Fields lay unplanted. Roads led through silent villages where only ashes remained. Chroniclers later wrote that entire regions lost half their population. Some areas lost more. The kingdom that had once stood as a powerful barrier between Eastern and Western Europe had been reduced to something closer to a graveyard. From the perspective of the Mongol commanders, the campaign had been another success in a long chain of victories. Another enemy broken, another nation erased. But something unexpected was about to happen, because the Mongols would not remain in Hungary long enough to finish what they had started. And the kingdom they believed destroyed would rise again. In the spring of 1242, something changed. For more than a year, the Mongol armies had swept through Hungary with unstoppable force. Cities burned. Survivors hid in forests or behind castle walls, waiting for the next wave of destruction. Then, suddenly, the Mongols began to leave. At first, the reports sounded impossible. Scouts returned with strange news. Mongol riders were abandoning camps, withdrawing eastward across the plains they had conquered so easily months earlier. Entire formations were disappearing from Hungarian territory, moving back through the mountain passes toward the lands of the steppe. No final battle, no triumphant occupation. They were simply gone. The reason lay thousands of miles away. In the distant Mongol capital, the great Khan, Ögedei Khan, had died. According to Mongol tradition, the princes of the empire were required to return east for the election of a new supreme ruler. The Western campaign, no matter how successful, could not continue without them. So the Mongol army withdrew. Europe had been spared not by strength, but by circumstance. Yet the survival of Hungary required more than luck. King Bela IV returned to a kingdom that had nearly ceased to exist. Villages were empty, fields were ruined, entire noble families had vanished during the invasion. The devastation forced him to confront a hard truth. Hungary had fallen too easily. So Bela began rebuilding the kingdom from its foundations. He ordered the construction of stone fortresses across the land, replacing the weak wooden defences that had failed during the invasion. Towns were fortified. New settlers were invited from across Europe to repopulate devastated regions. The kingdom slowly reorganized itself around stronger defences and a more resilient society. The transformation took years, but it worked. Decades later, when Mongol forces attempted to invade Hungary again, they discovered a very different country waiting for them. Stone castles blocked their advance. Organized defences slowed their raids. The easy destruction of 1241 could not be repeated. Hungary had survived. Not because it had won the battle at the Sajo River, but because it refused to remain broken by defeat. Centuries later, the fields around the river remain quiet. Grass grows where wagons once burned. Birds cross the sky where arrows once fell like rain. Travellers pass through the valley without realizing how close Europe once came to catastrophe. But beneath the soil lie the remains of thousands of soldiers who fought on that cold morning in April. A silent reminder of the day the Mongol storm nearly swept through the heart of Europe, and the kingdom that refused to disappear.